Robby, what's on your radar?
While former Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe's loss to Republican challenger Glenn Youngkin was cemented very late on election night last night, in practice, the day that he forfeited the gubernatorial race was September 28th. That was when, during a debate with Youngkin, McAuliffe made the statement that, quote, "I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach."
What we've seen over the course of the last 20 months is our school systems refusing to engage with parents. In fact, in Fairfax County this past week, we watched parents so upset because there was such sexually explicit material in the library they had never seen. It was shocking. And in fact, you vetoed the bill that would have informed parents that they were there. You believe school systems should tell children what to do. I believe parents should be in charge of their kids' education.
Mr. McAuliffe, 30 seconds.
So first of all, this shows how clueless Glenn Youngkin is. He doesn't understand what the laws were because he's never been involved here in helping Virginia. But it was not. The parents had to write to veto books, Glenn, not to be knowledgeable about it, also take them off the shelves. And I'm not going to let parents come into schools and actually take books out and make their own decision.
You vetoed it.
So, yeah, I stopped the bill that I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach.
So that was his response to questions about school curriculum and the fury that had taken hold at many local school board meetings, where irate parents assailed education leaders for allegedly supporting what has been termed critical race theory by right-wing activists who oppose it. Now, CRT is a divisive concept in part because progressives and conservatives, well, they disagree sharply about what it even is. Many members of the liberal media don't believe it exists and have accused the GOP of making up the issue. As Youngkin's victory became apparent, MSNBC host Nicole Wallace lamented that critical race theory, which, quote, isn't even real, had swung the suburbs 15 points in Republicans' favor.
I think we know the answer to some of this. I watched Glenn Youngkin's interviews on Fox News, and he did nothing that he did not. I mean, he worshipped at the altar of Donald Trump on Fox News. He flew an insurrection flag at his rallies. He simply didn't. He played dumb about a Zoom rally. He did not really put much distance between himself and Donald Trump on the big lie or the deadly insurrection in which police officers were maimed by flagpoles. So I think that the real ominous thing is that critical race theory, which isn't real, turned the suburbs 15 points to the Trump insurrection-endorsed Republican. What do Democrats do about that?
Well, they shouldn't listen to Nicole Wallace. Christopher Ruffo, a conservative activist and the architect of the current CRT framing, has claimed a well-deserved victory. He was talking about it on Twitter. And there's no question that his efforts to supply a memorable name, critical race theory, for the series of semi-related, clumsy diversity initiatives and questionable curriculum choices in some public schools, not all of them, but some of them, helped raise the salience of the issue. Now, progressives are right that critical race theory is, at its essence, an obscure academic theory most often taught in grad school about how fundamental, how important racism is to modern life. But it has inspired a whole coterie of activist educators, authors, and diversity consultants to stress the differences between the races explain all sorts of inequities in society. The con artist authors like Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi, who scam gullible white audiences out of huge sums of money by pointing out in pointless workshops for them that stress the audience's culpability in white supremacy and provide no meaningful avenue for ever overcoming it. Those were inspired by critical race theory. I have seen critical race theorists' writings appear in diversity training documents and curriculum diversity requirements in K-12 schools. Critical race theory itself is not taught, but a whole host of highly questionable related topics are, and often taught by people who did study critical race theory. But the other piece of this puzzle undoubtedly was public schools' utter failure throughout the pandemic, as Ryan discussed in his radar. Schools shut down for months, offloading teaching duties to frustrated parents all over the country. The education system forced families to take more responsibility for educating kids. It catered to the every whim of teachers' union leaders like American Federation of Teachers President Randy Weingarten, no matter how unreasonable, while kids and their parents were left to fend for themselves. It put public employees ahead of citizens and taxpayers, and it continued to subordinate the needs of families for more than a year. Even at present, long after it has become perfectly clear that COVID-19 is not a significant threat to most children, many public schools in blue municipalities continue to force kids to wear masks. Some kids have to wear masks even while playing sports outdoors. What happened in the Virginia gubernatorial election is that a reckoning finally arrived. Parents rightly objected to the idea that they should assume more and more of the school system's responsibilities, but should not enjoy any authority. And they clearly blamed Democrats for taking the side of teachers' unions. K-12 parents broke decisively for Youngkin. Critical race theory has now taken center stage in this unrelenting culture war, to the extent that Joy Reid now thinks education is code for, quote, white parents don't like the idea of teaching about race. That attitude is a recipe for continued failure, for alienating Democratic voters. The more the media calls parents racist for wanting to exert some influence over their kids' educational options, the worse off Democrats will be. So I agree with, a lot of what you said in your radar about how the pandemic and the school closures really annoyed parents. And then I think the thing about critical race theory, the curriculum debate, was then a way for them to kind of vocalize their frustrations. And I want to be clear. I understand, when people say, well, critical race theory isn't being taught in schools, they're right. The literal actual theory, critical race theory, is taught at the college level. It is not children are not being instructed in it. But what is true is that a lot of people who learned from critical race theory now teach diversity workshops and make curriculum. There's increasingly diversity requirements in K-12 schools. California has one. I looked at the curriculum. It's terrible. The kids hate it. It is true that there's a lot that even a progressive person, even a liberal, a Democrat, would see in that and go, this is kind of, maybe not the biggest deal in the world, but this is not well thought out. It's not very scientific, and kids don't like it, and I don't like it, and this isn't what I would choose. And that's what the right has decided to call critical race theory. So if we're talking about that, that is in some schools. It's making its way through schools, and I think while some of the opposition to it is hyperbolic, not all of it is.
And I think it could help people from the left understand the issue here by realizing that corporate America has deeply embraced this thing. I think we need the left needs another word for it than critical race theory. You obviously don't want to just take Ruffo's he's a political operative. Like his
100%.
His goal was to frame something in the most toxic way possible that could also enter the mainstream and be damaging to Democrats. And congratulations to him. He pulled it off. And there are these kind of political tricksters throughout our history that have played these outsized roles by just kind of lucking into the right language and the right issue that they're able to kind of put a little twist in the way history unfolds. So therefore, Democrats need a different word to understand the phenomenon, because there is a real phenomenon that is going on here, and it is omnipresent in corporate America, and it is as you said, it's expressed through these DEI offices, like the takeover of HR departments over the past several years by these diversity, equity, and inclusion offices is almost complete. And you have to then ask yourself, why is it that corporate America would be so comfortable with this ideology, with this politics, if it did anything remotely to challenge the status quo or challenge corporate America? And of course they would not. Corporate America is not in the business of undoing corporate power, or undoing establishment power, or undoing concentrated, elite power in the United States. So what does it do? Well, it flows right out of the neoliberal idea that the individual matters above all else, and that there's nothing you can do collectively in this world. So don't even bother trying. All you can do is work on yourself. And so out of that flow all sorts of wellness studies, the entire self-help genre that blew up from the 80s up through today. And then the DEI ideology, which tells you that the way to make the world a better place is to examine your own whiteness and repent and interrogate and educate yourself. Yeah. And through that process, well, they don't actually explain how through that process we're going to get to a better world.
Got to buy the next book.
Buy the next book, but you're going to then be a better person. Right. And so then you will not be responsible for all of the terrible things that are happening in the world. But there's but there's no effort to actually change the world to make it so that these terrible things aren't happening. And so that's why corporate America is okay with it. It has now flowed into the schools, and Democrats should do one of two things: defend this in the public schools and say, no, we ought to be teaching, we ought to be doing this style of social studies. We ought to, here's what we're doing, and we should be doing it, defend it, or change it.
Right.
But instead, what they do is they say, this isn't happening. It's not. And people are like, well, I mean, I see what my kid brings home from school. Right. It is happening.
Right.
And so they don't trust them then.
Clearly, that was not a winning message. Well, we'll be discussing this and much more election stuff coming up next, and obviously in the coming days. Team Rising joins us next. Stick with us for that.